I want to talk to you today about the immediate post-war period. And I think it's important before we even get into the problem of a famine, which is not particularly well known, and to which there's relatively little academic consideration. We try to put ourselves into the shoes or into the context of the immediate post-war period in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. This was a time where in the Soviet Union, the areas which would become the worst affected by famine had undergone occupations by different sides, the massive decimations of their populations due to wartime activity, hunger, disease, and a range of other problems that would come to the fore and would continue actually long after the war had finished. So when we talk about post-war famine, we're really talking about the continuation of not only the consequences of a terrible war, but so many of its features enduring past what we would consider to be the end of the war period and peacetime. This famine of 1946-1947, primarily it was in southwest Ukraine, in Moldova, but which was felt across the Soviet Union, killed possibly about 1 million people. But so many of its victims in 1946-1947 remained behind the Iron Curtain. Victims of previous Soviet famines, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, as a result of the Second World War, became displaced persons, were in camps, ended up in the West, and were able to discuss and sustain memory, academic, and political interest in that particular famine, in ways so that it became far well known in these areas. 1946-1947, however, behind the Iron Curtain, really public discussion of this famine, even within the Soviet Union, was only possible after its collapse in 1991. Even then, however, the type of interest among historians for the 1930s, for these earlier famines, has been far greater than it has been for the immediate post-war period, including for this famine. So we run a project writing or attempting to write one of the first comprehensive histories of this entire famine, not only to address a serious problem in the literature, but also to improve public understanding of the last famine, not only in Soviet, but to date in European history. In this particular lecture, we'll talk more about the origins of famine and how it's caused. Stephen, afterwards, after about 25 minutes of me speaking, we'll talk a little bit more about how famine operates, its larger context, chronological and geographical, as well as about mortality. Now, much of the small literature considers this famine to begin really in late 1946 and early 1947, and its fundamental focus are on these 2 years. What we found in our work, working out of Russian, Ukrainian, and Moldovan archives, is that the causes of this famine are far, we need to understand them in a far broader chronological context. We really pick up the problem from the beginning of the war. We look at the ways in which different occupation powers, Soviet, German, Romanian, across these areas, how their policies interacted with other problems to cause significant problems for the population in agricultural production and so forth, and in the health of the population, and particularly when the Soviets re-established control in these areas as they came back through the western parts of the Soviet Union in 1944. From then, there was a sense among the Soviet leadership that given the overall wartime destitution across the Soviet Union, and given the needs to supply the Red Army, it was necessary to shift the economic burdens of the country onto the newly occupied areas, which were hoped would be able to provide for food back east and for the army in ways that were far greater than could be possible in the areas of the unoccupied Soviet Union from 1941 to 1943. There was great optimism that reconquering these breadbaskets, particularly in Ukraine, would be able to solve these multitude of problems. Part of this optimism is needed to explain why, in 1945, they began to extract from these areas far more grain than they had before the war. In fact, at a time when agricultural production was about half of the pre-war level, they were extracting more than they had beforehand. This placed an incredible strain on the majority peasant population that produced the grain in these areas and left far less grain on the ground for them to consume. There's a range of other factors that we look at, but the fundamental point is that a lot of these areas were placed into a far more destitute position as a result of reconquest, as a result of the culminating problems of their experiences of war and occupation, even before we have a massive drought in the middle of 1946. We have a failed harvest that is usually considered the fundamental reason, or one of the reasons for the drought. For the famine. Going back to the broader context in which this famine emerges, we have in 1946 the intensification of a Cold War. We have a massive, violent insurgency being waged in the newly occupied area of Western Ukraine against Soviet power. We have the massive demobilization of 6, 7, up to 9 million soldiers in 1945 and 1946 coming back into society from the Red Army. Now, we might consider this, particularly in the West, as to be a normal sort of development and not to attract far too much attention. But in Soviet and indeed in Russian history, demobilization had always been a particularly tense time, a time when Soviet Russian leaderships were fearful that large masses of men returning to society could cause significant problems. And the major concern, at least in places where the famine would become more developed in Ukraine, was that large groups of men coming back from the army would come back and see how destitute and hungry their families had become, partly as a result of Soviet policies, become more angry at the state and join the anti-Soviet insurgent and subversion movements that were operating against the state at this time. This was a war that continued long after the end of the Second World War. So from the Soviet perspective, the convergence of all these different factors meant that famine, or at least food shortage even beforehand, was one of many interconnected problems concerning this transition from war to post-war. Okay. Here's a little bit about just some general sense of what's going on from 1944 and 1945 when these areas in southwest Ukraine and Moldova are reconquered. I've talked already about the excessive procurements. Procurements are of grain. So the way it generally works is that you have the majority of the population in the countryside that produces grain, either in collective farms, that is directly for the state, or as individual peasants who are taxed very highly by the state for their produce. As a result of these, particularly of grain, which is the main staple, as we can see in 1945 alone, 5 million tonnes are procured, 10% more than it had been in the last pre-war year of 1940, when agricultural production was doubled. So if you could imagine, you're taking more grain from people who are producing half as much as they had before war. This is an incredible squeeze. At the same time, we can't just look at procurements, we need to understand how much grain is sent back into these regions. The whole point of the central procurement system in the Soviet Union was to procure grain from some areas to feed others, but then of course, through rail and other types of transport, they could redirect food to areas that required it, or people who were on what we call central supplies. Even when we take that data into account, what we see is that from the areas that would become the most heavily affected by famine, in 1944 and 1945, and even the first parts of 1946, there is far less grain going back into these areas than is taken out. The situation of the overall food available in these areas is incredibly catastrophic before the harvest fails in 1946 and the famine occurs. What does this mean on the ground? One of our great privileges we have is to work with certain types of documentation, intercepted letters from people experiencing famine at the time that are provided in different security archives. The Soviets had one of the most extensive, probably the most extensive mail surveillance operation systems in the world. In, I think it's February 1946, security services surveyed over 5 million letters in Ukraine alone. They removed from circulation about 30,000 of them because they were considered to be seditious, dangerous. They arrested some of the people who'd written the letters. They blanked out with black ink those areas, those sections of the letters that were particularly concerning. But what that tells us is that a lot of these letters that are sent from wives, families of Red Army soldiers who were serving at the front, despite their removal, a lot of them get through. And as I said before, this was one of the major concerns, that these types of letters that are saying to soldiers who are serving and fighting in the war, or are then in the process of demobilization, that the state is allowing your children to die, the state that you were serving. It's time you came home. And the concern is that angry, hungry soldiers coming home might cause problems for the state. And this is why we know about this, because this became one of the major concerns of the security agencies at this time. It also allows us a window into how ordinary people at this time understood what was happening to them, how they dealt with food shortage, with famine, how they dealt with the mass death around them. There's thousands of these to which we have access. They're very important sources. All this is happening before the harvest of 1946 fails. Now, in the summer of 1946, in places of southwest Ukraine, I'll just show you a map just to get a sense so you know what we're talking about. You see the dark areas, this is a map of famine mortality, but we'll use it just for geography now. In that really dark red area, these are the areas that become the worst affected by famine in 1947, but they are the exact same areas that I've been talking about that were subject to the most rapacious grain procurements from 1945 onward. They were the areas where far less food was being shipped back in for the sake of the urban population. And so these areas that would become the epicenter of drought that I'm talking about in the summer had already been placed in a further position from their experience of wartime destitution, from their experiences of occupation, which had caused the massive removal of agricultural machinery, draft power, even labour, which could allow agricultural production to recover after the war. Had already been placed in this position before famine occurs. What do they do when the harvest fails? How do we know the harvest fails? Well, there's a terrible drought. The heat burns so much of the crop, not much of it is left. As far as we can understand, agricultural production, or at least in grain from 1946, is about 40% of the pre-war level. So why do we have such a situation? Why and what happens in response? The Soviet regime decides that the only way to deal with the problem of having far less food to feed a rapidly rising population is to reduce how much they eat. That is to reduce food consumption. They do that through a variety of laws. They take about 27 or 28 million people off food rationing, considering that they can find their own way if they live in rural areas. They reduce the rationing rights or entitlements of other parts of the population as well. And they put more pressure on grain producing areas, particularly the collective farm system, by procuring more so to be in a position that they can distribute more, so they say. This has incredibly deleterious impacts on much of the peasant population in the areas that would become the epicenter of famine, just as we get into the winter of 1946 and 1947. Now, we should add that one of the reasons why this seems such a drastic step is from 1944 onward, the Soviet leadership had never particularly made necessary, taken measures that in the event of something like a drought occurring would give them a sufficient reserve in order to deal with it. Instead, they continued from 1944 to export grain on the international market, mostly for foreign currency, but also to exercise soft power in Europe, in the new empire that was emerging. Also in 1946, we have an international food crisis. It's in this country that food rationing was only introduced in 1946. So international grain is harder to buy, and selling it at least in 1945, 1946, was far more profitable. This would stop at the height of the famine. It would not continue in the same way, but still, they placed themselves in a situation through their policies, through their way in which they were dealing with coastal agriculture, that meant when the harvest failed and when famine was looming, their capacities to deal with it in a way that would save more people's lives was already drastically reduced. Let's talk a little bit about the individual countries that are involved. So the two main countries that are involved, Ukraine, particularly only the southwest part of it that I showed, where famine levels were, mortality levels really reached famine proportions. But most of Moldavia, a small little place, Moldova, were about 2 million people, where about 125,000, 5% of the population died as a result of the famine, as far as we can understand. The problem for places that were much bigger, like Ukraine, was that it was expected to take care of. That means its fundamental duty within the Soviet system was to produce grain that would be procured to feed other places. And it was expected from that which was remained to be able to feed itself, that is, most of ration recipients who lived in Ukraine. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were expected to live off what was left to them after procurements. Of course, when procurements were extremely excessive, as they were in 1946, not much was left for them to live on. We have real insight into how this process worked. We had access to really fantastic sources. These are stenographic accounts of Politburo meetings of the Soviet leaders, this is in Ukraine in October 1946 between Khrushchev and others. And Khrushchev here is saying on the right side that we are required to provide vegetables, that is potatoes and so forth, to Moscow and Leningrad. And the only way we can provide them now, if you look back on the left side, is to send really hard-edged people to go out into the countryside to pick up all of the food that the peasants have been hiding. And so Khrushchev is key in this process, not of simply taking more grain for the sake of it, but because he's under incredible pressure from Moscow to provide supplies outside of the country, but also to feed urban recipients within his own country. He's responsible for feeding much of the cities. So imagine this just for a moment in places like Ukraine. More grain is being taken out in 1945 and 1946 than had been before the war, at a time when agricultural production is about half or even less of that level. What is left on the ground for people to consume is miserly, and at the same time, the pressure from the leadership within Ukraine is so severe that they're going back out in successive waves to take more and more food in order to feed other places and the cities. This is before the winter of 1946, 1947, and it's not for nothing that in the spring of the following year, as we get out of the winter, when the peaks of mortality start to really take hold. So what's important, I think, to understand is that we have a culmination of factors over many years, a type of approach, a rapacious approach toward agriculture in areas that were already incredibly destitute by war and occupation, whose people have been hungry for years. And when we have a terrible natural event, like a serious drought, that tips the situation over towards famine, that is accelerated by the types of decisions that are made by the Soviet leadership in response. Now, how does the Soviet regime respond? I've already said that their behavior, an inhumane approach toward the vast majority of its own population, agricultural policies that didn't take into account the possibilities of serious drought and agricultural drops in production, but a constant optimism about each harvest producing more and more grain, effectively covering the mistakes of the previous one, already placed them in a terrible situation to deal with the harvest when it failed. By 1947, particularly the spring, it's clear that lots of people are dying. The Soviet regime know about this. In fact, they knew about it earlier. How much did they know? Well, the most trusted lines of communication are from the secret security services. And the heads of the security services in places like Moscow, Ukraine, and Moldova are writing to Stalin from December 1946 and telling him how serious the situation was. This is an instructive letter. It's from Lazar Kaganovich, who was one of Stalin's most trusted lieutenants, who he actually sent to Ukraine in March 1947 because he was so angry with Khrushchev for his failures to operate well in agriculture and for his continual complaints about how many people were dying and what sort of support they needed. Only 2 months after his arrival, Kaganovich writes back to Stalin in a co-signed letter with Khrushchev telling him, sorry, big, I have to walk here, that 1 million people are suffering from dystrophy. Dystrophy is a Soviet term for sort of a hunger, starvation disease. That 1 million people out of a population of just over 30 are suffering from this. Many of them will die. He's asking for aid to deal with these people, to send aid that will not usually come. Most of that aid doesn't. What does come is what we call strategic aid. The letter on the right, this is an acceptance letter that says what we'll actually provide you is aid for collective farmers who agree to continue to work in these conditions on the farms and to engage in the spring sowing. So they're providing aid only to those people who are part of a collective farm system who will engage in the spring sowing, whose summer harvest, everyone hopes, will be sufficient to bring them out of famine. Now, this is a logical decision, but it's one that requires the abandonment of those people, particularly in urban areas, who are listed as part of the 1 million that require aid as well. And again, the reasons why we get into this terrible situation has a lot to do with the way sort of the Soviet class system operates, the hostility of the regime towards the peasantry, but also because the decisions and practices in the years preceding this famine had placed the Soviet leadership in a position where it was unable to do more or much more, but for which, of course, they are ultimately responsible. Showing you the map. I think I'm on about 25 minutes. I'll just spend a minute more before I bring Stephen in. But here it's really important to understand that this southern area where it's almost black, that's what's now still in Ukraine as Izmail Oblast, a place of about 400,000, 450,000 people. That's where in Ukraine the worst famine mortality was taken. In just some crude numbers, in the 1 year of 1947 compared to the year of 46 and 48, we have generally stable populations. 3 times as many people die in 1947 in the absence really of infectious diseases, mostly from hunger. Right bank of Ukraine, which is in the right bank Moldova, which is in the right bank of the Dniester River, experiences a similar problem. The vast majority of these people are individual farmers, not part of the collective farm system. That means that they are taxed heavily by the state for their produce. And unlike the rest of the population across most of Ukraine and the rest of the Soviet Union, they are not collectivized. We can talk about that more in the discussion. Some of the bigger questions that emerge from filling a significant gap in the literature, but also, I think, bringing a human element to this terrible period, asking where does a famine like this sit in a longer history of Soviet and famines in the Russian Empire? What does a study of a famine like this tell us about the collisions of ongoing problems in post-conflict societies, poor decision-making and drought, and famine that emerges from this? And what does it tell us about situations like that now that we see throughout, particularly the developing world, continuing to appear? So I'll leave those questions with you, and I'll bring in Stephen, who'll talk about this in more detail.
Again, delighted to be here. I'm going to cover some broader questions. Firstly, what does the 46-47 famine tell us about Soviet history? Now, our friend Yuri has suggested that we call the project the Famine of the Victors. And to some extent, I think we all quite like this title. There's a certain irony in this. How could the mighty victors who had just defeated the greatest army in the world fall victim to a simple famine. Either they were not as powerful as it seemed, or the famine was not so simple as it seems. Now, I favor the latter explanation on this. I think the problem is there's been an enormous underestimation of the problems caused by natural events ever since the revolution, in fact, before the revolution, right up to 1946. I think an underestimation in the views of the actually pre-revolutionary government, as well as the Soviet government, and actually in the views of historians as well. So I'm on a crusade to try and put that right. I have a lovely little sort of anecdote here, I suppose, in 1925, when the great Russian agro meteorologist Abulkov gave a presentation to an economic conference in Moscow and argued, we have to pay respect to the weather. It's an important factor. And he rather foolishly used the expression, pay respect to Господин Urajai. And from the audience, party hack Strumirin shouted out, "Это не Господин Urajai, это товарищ Urajai." And this, I think, was very much the feeling at the time. There are no fortresses the Bolsheviks could not overcome. Weather was not important. We're going to overcome that. First 5-year plan expected to improve grain yields by 35% in 5 years, when Rykov suggested, maybe it's not a good idea to think that we're going to have 5 good harvests in a row without there being one poor harvest. Of course, he was denounced for his right-wing deviationism. That's totally unacceptable. This is the optimism sort of built in, the neglect of the natural factors, and the enormous underestimation of the power that I think of the importance of weather and the problems of the grain problem, which underlined much of Soviet history. I'd go actually further, because it's the major factor in the end of Tsarist history. We tend not to forget that the February Revolution took place with food riots in the capital in a very serious food supply problem. I mentioned earlier, I've always felt that when we celebrated the centenary of the 1917 Russia a few years ago, very little recognition of the importance of weather was paid. I think in hardly any academic publication. Fedorov in Russia was one of the few historians who wrote something on that. It's ironic that in 1946, just after Abulkov had died, his posthumous works were published in Moscow. You could often claim, if you're going to say something controversial, it's probably a good idea to die just before you do it, so that it can be published with some degree of resistance. Weirdly enough, Strumirin, now an academician, wrote the preface to this. In fact, in a moment of unusual frankness, he actually, quite honestly said something real. In the past, we had tended to think that as technology improved, the importance of agriculture, of weather variations, would be less important. But we've learned that that is not the case. And of course, Strumirin was not talking out of line with party policy. Party policy had very much changed at this time, which I think is characterized by the great Stalin plan, the transformation of nature, a realization that there was something wrong in the way they were approaching nature before. Not to say they were now getting it right, thinking they could automatically just change it with a great plan, but at least it was a recognition of this factor. And I'll come back to talk more about this in a few minutes. What does the 46-47 famine tell us about Soviet history? I think one of the big things that the 46-47 tells us about the war, and that is that we were all extremely lucky that there was no serious drought and harvest failure in 1941, 42, 43, 44, or 45. There were about 6 years, an uncharacteristically long period of relatively good drought-free weather in the late spring and summer critical periods, which would have been, well, very serious, to the point I think of being catastrophic had they occurred in 42, 43 or 41. And in fact, the return of the very regular event of a serious drought only came in 46. And when it did come in 46, was of a particularly harsh kind. Now, there's whenever you say things like, oh my God, whenever you say things like this, there's normally a great presumption that you are exaggerating the figures, and that the people are using this as an excuse, and there's no real reality behind it. At this point, I was going to show you some wonderful graphs, which unfortunately appear to have got lost somewhere. But I can assure you, what I'll do probably is I'll give you the PowerPoint, which we can reproduce later on. But the PowerPoint would show definitively from a totally objective source for information. Oh, stay where it sounds. For information on the Soviet Union, you couldn't get more objective than say an American government publication organization like NASA and the Goddard Center, who've got the best meteorological data. Of course, they needed it for sending up rockets and things. We'll put that on when I send the PowerPoint. So from the Goddard Center, you can actually work out monthly weather records on a sort of global map for each month back to about 1880. And if you just run up the critical, spring, summer weather over the Soviet Union for the years I'm talking about, 1940 through to 45, you can see that they are all characterized by an unusually cool late spring, early summer period, which were, almost the optimal weather for avoiding drought. And there is then going to be an enormous shift, which looks much better on a map than I can describe in words, showing just how there really was a major change at that point. These other okay, the second part, after the disaster of not having the graphs, we'll move on to comparing the 46-47 famine with other Soviet famines, and hope that something appears here as well. But the important thing here is to note that there were a lot of famines in Russia and the Soviet Union. They were frequent events. We normally date the earliest Russian famine from 1891, but that is ridiculous because that was the first event that was actually recognized and treated as a famine. But in fact, harvest failures with high levels of mortality occurred well before then on a frequent basis. And I like to go back to the 1867 one, which was extraordinarily important, not all over the Russian Empire, but in certain extreme areas, but particularly in the Baltic, and particularly, in fact, for Finland, which, remember, was part of, say, the Russian Empire, not part of the 72 gubernia of the Russian Empire, but the semi-autonomous, but really totally dependent Grand Duchies of Poland and Finland. And Finland in 1867 experienced the worst drought, the worst famine, with the highest levels of mortality than any other famine in Finnish history, much higher than 1891, the 1918 to 20, 32, 33, this, or even the post-Second World War ones. This was an extremely important one. People tended not to talk about it and use the word famine at the time, and my Finnish historian friends tell me that this was not just a, if you like, Slavic phenomena of not using the word famine, but even in the Finnish one, it was not at the time treated as such, although subsequently it was. In Soviet, now I would describe these pre-revolutionary famines, particularly say the one 1867, 1891, 92, as being relatively simple in terms of the fact that they really only affected the area in which there was a harvest failure, and it didn't have enormous knock-on effects in other parts of the country. This was very different to what's going to happen with the three post-revolutionary sets of famine periods, which of course include the immediate revolutionary and post-revolutionary period, 1917 to 1922, which I'd like to break down as two separate famines, really. The famine in the northern consumer region, of course, with Moscow and St. Petersburg at its center, very serious from 1917 through to 1920. And these were areas that were highly dependent upon, or in normal circumstances, highly dependent upon food coming up from the south. I'll put up a, well, I might as well put up now a map characterizing the main consumer regions and producer regions. Pre-revolutionary times, much greater emphasis was given to the fact that 26 of the 50 gubernia of European Russia were classified as consumer regions, basically because they did require grain to come out of those regions from further south to provide mainly the urban populations of the northern consumer region. Most importantly, of course, St. Petersburg, but then also Moscow. When we talk about the cities being supplied by grain, the image is often, you know, the local peasants with a horse and cart bringing the grain into the local cities. And of course, most major European capitals were originally built in major grain surplus areas. And so this is where it originated. Later on, when they were developed, grain had to be brought in from elsewhere. But with Russia, we're in a very different situation. Kiev, of course, was in a major grain surplus producing areas back in the 1,000 years earlier. But by the time we get up to the times of Muscovy, Moscow itself is requiring large amounts of grain to come up the Volga from the more fertile Black Earth regions, the so-called Central Chernozem, or the locations along the Volga, bringing them up to Moscow. This is before Peter the Great builds, or Peter the First, sorry, I promise not to call him great any longer. The Peter the First builds the new capital in St. Petersburg in 1703, requiring now vast amounts more grain to be transported 700 kilometers further north into a far more inhospitable, less fertile, weather-challenging district to which there's no readily, easily waterway connection because you're over the water divide from the northern rivers to the southern, requiring canals to be built to be brought in. So after Peter's done this from the beginning of the 18th century, the requirements of grain into the consumer regions mounts up to about 5 million tons a year on the eve of the First World War. So this is 5 million tons of grain brought in to the red areas on the top there, the northern consumer region, most of it initially coming from the central producer region, that's the one in green, the central Black Earth provinces, and then the Volga. And then from the middle of the 19th century, we see an enormous expansion of grain production in the southern producer region, in the southern parts of Ukraine and in the North Caucasus. Much of this, when the rail transportation becomes available, is then actually sort of exported. And let us remember, therefore, that on the eve of the First World War, not only was 6 million tons, 5 or 6 million tons being transported annually into the northern consumer region, but up to about 8 to 10 million tons was being exported out of the south, largely through, through the Black. Well, 8 to 10 million was being exported altogether. Most of that out of the south, some over the land borders, and a bit through the Baltic. Thirdly, we have the eastern producer region. That's the one in black there. Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, or the southern steppe, and the Russian Far East. This will tend to become more important in supplying grain to the consumer regions in Russia later on, and of course enormously so in the 1960s with the Virgin Lands campaign. Now, apart from this map with the 5 major regions, it's important to note that within several of these major regions, there are pretty important deficit micro regions. The Donbass, of course, within the southern producer region, the Urals industrial complex within the eastern production region, and also, in fact, the Russian Far East. But in the normal circumstances, the surplus supplies of the macro region are sufficient to provide for the micro region within those major regions. Anyway, this is the regionalization that we're working on when we come to look at these 3 complexes of famines. So the first, 1918 to 20, begins with this great shortage of grain in the northern consumer region. So they had been requiring 6 million tons. This was already getting problematic. That was 6 million tons just for the civilian population. It was the procurement of an additional 6 million tons for the army that began to throw the Tsarist government into trouble over this, which we could discuss if necessary. But the war, and particularly the civil war, breaking up, separating the northern consumer region from its supply regions, led to an absolutely colossal supply problem, shortage, mass famine in the northern consumer regions. And I think we tend to underestimate, again, the importance of this. Let me just remind you, this is, I think, Cormac's not here now, it's a shame, but I'll quiz him on this. But of major famines, if you want, was to look at deurbanization of the capital cities, I don't think we've got any other famine that could begin to rival the northern consumer region famine of 1916 to 1980. The populations of Moscow and St. Petersburg were each just over about 2 million at the beginning of this period, and St. Petersburg, future Leningrad, will go down to 800,000. Moscow will drop down only to about 1.1 million. So you've got roughly a 50% decline, a deurbanization, which I would suggest was probably unparalleled in world history until Pol Pot, year zero in Cambodia. So just try to remember that as we go through looking at these histories, because I think it's of absolutely colossal significance. What happens with such a catastrophic situation in the capitals, which the government is most seriously concerned about, and although historians 100 years later may have forgotten that in fact food shortages were an important factor in the February Revolution, I don't think any of the politicians at the time were in any doubt that continuation of this kind of situation was going to lead to massive instability and their own heads rolling. So there was great concern to improve the matters, as well as actually spontaneous movement from the workers and the population of the Northern Consumer Region, going out not just into the local regions, which really didn't have that much grain, but actually into the producer regions, going further. When we talk about the Meshochniki, got to realize it's not just going locally into the villages, it's going large distance is into the villages. So this pressure from the Northern Consumer Regions who are in famine, pressure directed against the producer regions, which earlier had not been in famine and which were always, prior to this, living fairly well, places enormous stress on them, lowers the amount of reserves that in fact the producer regions have. And when this is then combined with a harvest failure in the south that occurs in 1921 with the great drought of the Volga, actually then shifts the force of the famine from the Northern Consumer Region into the south, into the central producer region. And I suggest this is a kind of model that we can see happening in the two subsequent series of famines as well. That in 27 to 32, well, 27 to 33, we see an urban famine, risk of famine. At this point, it doesn't actually develop into a full-blown famine, but in fact, there are shortages, rationing is introduced. There are great fears of what will happening, and this, as students of the period know, leads at the time of 27-28 procurement crisis to the adoption of extraordinary measures directed against the countryside, which at first were considered to be temporary, but then become institutionalized. This then does lead to a weakening of the position in the countryside. It tends to get a little complicated. I always have problems with this because most people seem to want to claim that it was collectivization that caused the famine. What I always like to emphasize is it's the extreme procurements and extraordinary policies emanating from the Northern Consumer Region directed at the South, but in agriculture altogether, that destabilizes agriculture to the point that they are very worried that the peasants will no longer have any incentive to produce grain. And so collectivization is the necessity to hold agriculture together to avoid the famine that would have occurred in the northern regions had not those supplies been taken. So we see this pressure. The strange, history often works in strange ways. After collectivization has been carried out in an extraordinary, ruthless manner in 1929, Stalin himself begins to fear he's gone too far. And in March 1913, dizziness with success, he suddenly calls a halt. It does actually make a major political change. People often think he's just halting and blaming others and nothing much changing because they resume again. But he does make a major change because he moves away from, if you like, gigantomania, large-scale collective farms of the commune type, and introduces the idea that the model collective farm would be the artiel with a private plot for the peasants, which does actually put them into a much more stable position. So this is actually a major change, contribution to stability. We don't like to give Stalin credit for many things, but if you compare Russia with China and what Mao did, you can actually envisage a collectivization going further with communes being the model forms, and that would have been even worse, even though many of us find it difficult to imagine anything being worse than what actually happened. But in many cases, worse things were possible. As a result of collectivization, as I say, you would have expected there to be a disaster, and they deserved to have a disaster with the 1930 harvest. But as it so happened, the weather was extraordinarily good in 1930, probably the best weather since 1930. And so the weather saved the situation. The Bolsheviks didn't appreciate it as such. They thought that it just demonstrated that they were on the right track and could continue. And the famine then will come, not the next year again, although there will be a serious drought the next year, and then it will be the famine coming after that. I'm suggesting to some extent 41, 43 is obviously a major crisis for the northern consumer region, with the Germans' occupation of Ukraine, many of the grain surplus producing areas. There is extreme famine in St. Petersburg, but also in the rest of the northern consumer region. Things ease up in 44, 45, but with the drought of 46, we're seeing again a kind of repeat story. So that's the way it goes, and we do have extraordinary good, I think, statistical data. This is based on monthly mortality data. So you can see the 1946-47 monthly crude mortality data, but adjusted to its annual equivalents for Moldova, the worst affected region, reaching up to 160 per thousand deaths per year in annual equivalents. For 3 months, it's a double peak with a drop in between. And I've just put it on there in comparison with the worst case in the 32-33 famine, which is Kiev Oblast. Kiev Oblast mortality goes slightly higher, up to 199 deaths per thousand per year in annual equivalents. But it only goes up there for 1 month and then drops down very, very sharply. The Moldovan one is actually above 150 for 3 months, and it's got a wider base. And if we take roughly 50 to be the sort of base level of famine, we can see that the Ukrainian mortality of 32-33 is actually a narrower one in terms of the months covered, even though it's steeper. Moldovan one has 2 peaks and is slightly wider, doesn't quite go as high. And I put in the St. Petersburg 1916 to 20 figures there. This is it's up to over 50, so it's in the famine range. It doesn't get into the extreme high range, but it's there for a much longer. I think there's 2 years of it there. So this is the unprecedented situation that leads to an enormous decline. If one was to look at Ryan level mortality figures, Philip's already given you the Moldovan ones on the left. These are the Ukrainian ones on the right. The scales there are not quite comparable, and the Ukrainian mortality figures all ought to be a lot darker. What had been learned? Very little had changed in the fundamentals of this problem if you compare the 3 different famines. Excess procurements to save the northern consumer region was basically what's happening in all 3 of them. Although in 1946-47, we could see almost that the focus of where the procurements were coming from seemed to be more narrowly based on the southern producer region than the other producer regions, and even more so on the southwest in the years leading up to that. There were signs, however, that the state was beginning to change its ideas on the importance of weather as a factor. As I say, I suggest that the Great Stalin Plan for the Transformation of Nature indicates a greater awareness of the growing problem and attempts to do something about it, although what they were attempting to do about it was still very unrealistic and overambitious. But I would suggest that there's more to this. And we can see the beginnings of a more realistic approach to agriculture regarding grain levels. This is the difference between barn yields and bough yields. I like to emphasize, and I think it is extremely important, that Voznesensky, who, because he was shot by Stalin, is often treated as a heroic figure, but being shot by Stalin isn't necessarily enough to become a hero. You've got to do the right things before then. And Voznesensky was more than anyone responsible for corrupting the levels of statistics on both population and on grain production, leading to a highly exaggerated and inaccurate view of what the world really was. His exaggerated population figures were corrected largely in 1939, but the grain production exaggerations remained right through to 46, 47. But the fact that Voznesensky was arrested and shot after 1948, I think does indicate that he no longer had the full trust of Stalin that he did earlier, and that things were beginning to change in this regard. Of course, his downfall is, I think, correctly attributed to maybe his involvement of his brother in the Leningrad party affair, but that wouldn't have been enough to have got him killed if Stalin was prepared to defend him. But he had obviously lost Stalin was not interested in defending him. And I think it was partly because of the debacle of 46, 47. I would argue that within the statistical services, as soon as Voznesensky goes, you see a great revival in more objective statistical work, which will allow them to immediately move away from the distortions in Soviet agriculture, the barn yield biological exaggeration of grain yields by over 30% that existed right up until Stalin's death. But I'd like to point out that Stalin had only been dead a couple of weeks before this was immediately changed. The statistical officials had already prepared everything for it. I think they've been working on it ever since Voznesensky died. And this, I think, is one of the main changes that had appeared at this time as a result of the famine. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.